Welcome back. So today we want to go over Chapter 7, which has a few different topics, covering a few different kinds of lists, which we've already covered. We've talked about unordered lists, ordered lists, and definition lists a bit already. But we'll go in those a little bit deeper, as well as using some CSS to change how they look. Next, we'll talk about links in a little bit more depth than what we've talked about them so far. So we'll go over a few things that you might want to know when we're working with links, other attributes that you can add. And then finally, we'll conclude with talking about how to build navigation menus and how to build two-tiered navigation menus. So this is kind of all working towards, a lot of this is working towards that end goal of making navigation menus that are a little bit better than what we've covered so far. All right. So that's our main goal. By the end of this, we really want you to be able to create either navigation lists, navigation menus that are 1-tier, 2-tier, and 3-tier in size and scope. We want you to be able to name and describe the 3 different kinds of HTML lists. We want you to be able to understand how to use the anchor tags for linking to other pages, whether it be part of your website or another website. Using that to open those links in another tab, in a different tab. Using placeholders to link within a single page. So you might think like a table of contents is how that might look. We'll also look briefly at linking to media files such as PDFs, audio, video from within your page. We'll talk about how to set up a link to send an email, as well as links for dialing phone numbers, and Skype sessions. So we'll look at those 3. We'll kind of refresh on the pseudo-classes for links. So link, visited, hover, and focus. Again, we've kind of talked about a lot of this stuff already, but just refreshing and going deeper into it. Then we'll talk about how to maybe format your links using either text decoration or border. So that's kind of the deal here. Again, all this really leads into talking about navigation menus is really our goal with all these different topics. All right, so let's talk about lists first. So there's really 3 kinds of lists nowadays in HTML. There's the unordered list, the ordered list, and the definition list. There's historically been some other lists that have existed at certain points of time in the world of HTML, but really these are the only 3 that are broadly supported by browsers nowadays. So these are the 3 you want to know about. Okay, so let's start with some HTML. Let's start with an example. So let's say we have a simple unordered list. Here I've got a header, I've got an unordered list with 2 list items inside of it. I also see that inside of each of these list items, I've got some paragraphs of text, as well as even got some links, right? So William Sorian Theater is in a link here, I can see. All right, so let's look at what that might look like in the browser. Okay, so here I've got my header. Again, I've got my unordered list. You can see that with each of the bullets, but you can see that the second item has 2 paragraphs inside of it. That's why these are separated rather than being one block of text. You also see that I can put links in there and highlight specific things. Now, it is important to know that I can't, an anchor tag is an inline element. So what that does mean is I can't put the anchor tag around the LI. Anchor tags always have to be inside of the LI. Okay, so this is valid where I have the anchor tag inside of the LI. If I were to take the anchor tag and put it outside of the LI, that would then be invalid HTML, simply for the reason that UL and OL tags can only contain the LI. That's the only thing that they can contain. That's the only thing they're allowed to contain. So if you do it the other way around, the browser will kind of say, this isn't right, and add a kind of an imaginary li potentially, or decide to take the anchor tag completely out of the list. So make sure when you're mixing in list items and anchors, which we'll be doing for nav bars quite a bit. Make sure it's ul and then li and then a, specifically in that order of nesting. Another thing that we can do, sometimes we'll have more than one list. So this applies when we're doing ordered lists. You might want to say, okay, I've got 1, 2, 3, and then start another section, but keep the count going from the same point. So if I were to let this go as is, we've got one ordered list, another ordered list. Both of these have 3 list items. So if I were to just do this, normally this would be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Well, maybe I want this section to continue where the other one left off. So in that case, I can specify what the starting number is here. So I'm saying this starts at 4. So this will be 1, 2, 3, and then this will start at 4, 5, 6, which we can see in the example here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Because essentially we're having like a guide or tutorial of do steps A, B, and C, but they're trying to section it off so it's not all in one giant list. But that then breaks the numbers up. So if we want those to continue, then we use start. We can also nest list, which is very helpful for a lot of different cases, especially when we're talking about a nav bar. We may want to have multi-tiered navigation and such, and a nested list is good for that. So in this case here, we have an unordered list on the outside, and then each of these items, this item has an ordered list inside of it. This item also has an ordered list inside of it. And we can see this one starting at 1, this one will start at 4, which kind of makes it look like this. So at the outset, you can see the bullets, and then you can see indented into there is also the ordered list. Looking briefly at the description list, which is the third kind of list that we see, and this one was newly introduced with HTML5. It's really supported by all the browsers at this point. The difference being, remember, your typical ordered lists show like a bullet because there's no order to it. Your order lists have numbers or letters to say, here's what order they come into. Your definition list, on the other hand, the whole point of this is to give you the freedom to put some text there as your quote-unquote bullet, and that's where it's different. It allows you to put words there freely that are different for each point rather than that. So you can use this for strictly definitions, like here's the word and here's its definition, but it can be really used for anything where you need that sort of pairing where here's a thing and maybe there's a label for it and here's the input. So these can be used even for things like web forms, where you might want to say, well, here's the name of the field and here's the actual field. Sometimes this can be helpful for laying those out. All right, so we have the DTs, which is the definition term. We have the DD, which is the definition data or definition description. So each of those are paired. So you'll see these typically as DT, DD, DT, DT. It is important the order so that your definitions go with your actual terms. So here we can see how that would look like without any sort of CSS applied. We can see there's this series of terms: client and its description, web server, its description, LAN, what's a LAN, what's a wide area network, what's an internet exchange point. So all of those are terms are defined using that list, and you'll notice that the term is kind of always to the left by the default, and then there's a little bit of inset for the definition. Again, all of that you can change if you want to mess with the margin and the padding. You can change how those insets are set, how those insets appear, but that's how that will appear without any CSS applied on top of it. Now, let's talk about applying some CSS to those things. So first, let's talk about unordered lists. So with unordered lists, there's two different properties that I can set. One of those is the list style type, and the other is list style image. So list style type will change it to a specific icon that's already built in, or list style image I can use to set it to any image file that I have. And typically it does need to be a small icon. You don't want to use big icons for it, but that will allow you to put whatever icon you want there. So commonly used values, keywords for list style type are disk, square, and circle, which you can see here. So you've got a disk is a filled in sort of dot, a circle is a not filled in dot, you've got square, and then you can also set it to none, which will completely remove the bullets, which actually that's probably the most frequently used mode of unordered lists. Is to set it to none to turn the icons off, which we'll see when we get to our navigation bars is actually quite useful. So that we can keep the kind of semantics of an unordered list, but not the appearance. So if I want to apply that CSS, I might create a simple HTML file like this. I've got two unordered lists. This first unordered list I've set to class circle. The second one I've set to class star. Okay, so we can see ul.circle, so the unordered list that has the circle class. All right, I'm going to set list style type circle, so that first list should show circles as its bullets. For the second one, we should see this star image as its bullets. Okay, so we can see that here. So we've got circles here, we've got stars there. And the reason you might use the image here, you might use that image here as star. Well, there's no star keyword. You know, there are icons that you might want to use or you might want to use a custom icon, but that's not necessarily provided by the browser directly. So that's how that would look. Again, so here we're setting the list style type, and here we're setting the list style image. You can also shorthand either of these by using the list style shorthand. We'll take either of those. Other common values that we might use for list style type when we're working with ordered lists, there's a few different ways to get that to display. So decimal is the default, and that will just show it as a number followed by a dot. We can also specify it as decimal leading 0, which will add a leading 0, as you can see here, as 0, 1. We could specify it as lower alpha, so it's going to be a lowercase letter, so A, B, C, D, etc., or we can do upper alpha for uppercase letters. Also, if we want Roman numerals, we can say lower Roman would give us a lowercase I, etc., Roman numerals, or uppercase numerals. So if we look at an example with that, with an ordered list, here I've set its class to lower alpha. You can see the CSS for it. So we set list style type to lower alpha, and that switched it from, again, the default, which is numbers, to now letters. Okay. We might, when we're working with unordered lists, we might want to play around a little bit with the padding to get it to look different, and in some cases to get it to look the same on all the browsers, because different browsers apply slightly different padding to their unordered lists. So here we're setting the padding left first on the UL. It's just creating some space here. And then we're also, which is pushing the word, I think if I remember right, that 1 EM is what pushes the words over here. And then we're also setting some padding on the individual items, which, if I remember right, is what creates the space between the bullet and the text. And I also have some padding on the bottom so that they've got a little space in between each other. Okay, so that's unordered lists, ordered lists, definition lists. We covered a few different kinds of lists there and how to style them. The big new thing there is the list style type and list style image properties, which we haven't covered yet. Next, we want to talk a little bit about links and specifically anchor tags and some more of the things that we can actually do with anchor tags. So there's a few common attributes that we use with anchor tags. Some of them we've discussed already, some of them we haven't. href is how you set the URL that link is going to point to. Remember, that can be relative or it can be absolute. We'd also set the target. The target is how we determine which window or tab that document should open in. So if I leave it the default, I don't set a target, it will always open it in the same tab and window that you currently have open. Okay, and we'll talk about what you can set that to change that. The title attribute sets a tooltip tip that'll appear when you hover the mouse over that link. We can also set a tab index. By default, if we don't set any sort of tab index, it will generally cycle through your web page from the top to the bottom, left to right, and so that's usually good. But if you do need to change the tab order, you do want to change how things are organized. You can set tab index to change what order the tab appears. By default, the tab index for everything is 0. So if you change it to a number higher than 0, they'll kind of move it out of the other than 0. They'll move it out of the tab order and change where it falls. Do be careful with that. It's usually best to leave everything as its default tab index, but sometimes you can get into weird cases where the default tab index might not work, so you can use that to change it. Access key is another one that you can set. We generally avoid this one because it tends to create it can create more problems than it helps. It can be useful for accessibility sometimes, but you do definitely have to be wary with applying it willy-nilly. So what the access key is it says if the user presses this keyboard key, then that triggers this link. So I could say I want the access key for this link to be C. Well, then when they push C, it will act like it's clicking on that link. So for instance here, we've got some HTML with those things applied. I'm going to open that up in Visual Studio Code so we can actually play around with this. This is, I think this is 8 through 9. Yep, this is. Okay. So if I'm looking at the HTML here, this is the cart. Yeah, show shopping cart. So that's this link. If I press the C key, that seems to not be doing anything. So I'm not sure. So the access key for me is not doing anything. It also seems that the tab index that they've set of 0 hasn't done anything. Okay, so let's try something slightly different. If I say, let's make the tab index 1. Save that. So that should change the tab order there, which you can kind of see because I set it to 1, it sort of skipped the link, right, as I'm tabbing through. Or it put it in a different order. If it's just 0, that really has no effect. It's the same tab order. if I set it to, let's say maybe we set it to, so a positive number puts it later in the tab order, later than 0. And if I remember right, a negative number will remove it completely from the tab order. So that's one thing you have to kind of be aware from a usability standpoint. Putting a negative tab order will remove it from the tab order completely. But there may be cases where, for accessibility, you may occasionally want things not to be tabbed to. That is something, again, you have to be wary with. But there are some cases where that makes sense. So that's one thing you can use that for, is to remove things from the tab order. I'd say a negative is probably the most used. We definitely use that more than setting it to a positive, but there are cases for all of them. All right, so the access key, I must be missing something, because pressing C for me is not doing anything. I would expect it to at least highlight the that link, or do something with it, but that's not doing anything. The title, we can see that here. If I hover over TOC, table of contents, you can see that it gives me that tooltip that's specified in the title. All right, so let me go to the next slide. So just some accessibility guidelines when you're working with these, when you're working with links and these attributes. That title attribute is commonly used by screen readers, so adding it can definitely help them, but you do have to be aware that they are then going to read that, so take that with a grain of salt. So recognize that that title is used not just for the tooltip, but it's also used for screen readers. Tooltips, also worth noting, don't really work on touchscreens. So you're talking about your mobile device, your tablets. Those touchscreens generally can't show tooltips. The reason being, remember, the way we get the tooltip to show up is that I hover my mouse over it. Well, when you're working with a touchscreen, there's not really a way to hover your mouse without clicking on the item. Or if you are quote-unquote hovering by just putting your finger down but not releasing it, you're implicitly covering up part of the screen. And typically you're going to be covering up part of the screen where the tooltips are. So don't rely on tooltips working on touchscreens. They work great on laptops and desktops, but they do not work well. They don't really provide much value on touchscreens, unless the user is also using a screen reader with their phone or such. If the link has to be short, namely things like what we might put in a nav bar or navigation menu, which we'll talk about, it's definitely worth adding a title for accessibility to kind of explain what's on that page. So that's definitely one thing to consider for your navigation menus. It's pretty good to add a title, because those are generally pretty short amount of text that we actually put in the nav bar. It's also good if you have, say, a link that is an image or an icon, but doesn't actually include text. Absolutely put a title on there, both for the sake of screen readers as well as for the sake for users that are visiting your site and don't necessarily know what that icon means. So if your nav bar or whatever navigation method that you have is just here's an icon, definitely put a title on there, both to explain what that icon means, elaborate on it, as well as to provide some text that can be displayed if that image isn't there, isn't working for whatever reason. Okay. So talking about pseudo-classes that we can use with our links. There's kind of 5 commonly used ones. Link would be just your default state, your link that's not been visited. That's how we'll apply default formatting. The next would be visited. So generally we'll make links that you've already visited. We'll make them purple or some other color. And that helps give the user some sort of indication is if they've gone there already. Especially with larger sites, it can be easy for the users to get kind of lost and not know what pages have they already looked at to find the information they're looking at. So that visited color can definitely help for accessibility as your web pages get large. Hover is we can apply styles to a link specifically when the mouse is over it. Remember, as we were talking about a minute ago, hovering isn't really a practical thing with the touchscreen. So those styles that you're applying to hover, usually to change it to a different color, remove the underline, increase the font size. There are all sorts of things you can do there. Recognize that those styles don't really apply to touchscreens. Okay. For accessibility purpose, remember that there are plenty of users that we'll talk about that in a minute. Focus is also, we can also apply focus to links to say, here's the styling I want you to have if you currently have keyboard focus where you've tabbed to it. And then finally, there's an active state as well. I think the browser support for this has maybe changed a bit, but historically you could set styles for when the mouse is down but not released. So that would be the active state. So sometimes we might say, well, let's change it to one color when you hover or focus it, and then we'll change the link to a third color when you actually click on it. It's oftentimes how we would use that. If we want to if we want to add or remove underlines to our links, we can do that one of 2 ways. We can either add that as an underline style, which we would do through text decoration. So we'd say text decoration none to turn off the underline, text decoration underline to put it there. We can by default, links in most browsers already have an underline applied that's applied all the time. A lot of times what we'll do for links throughout the website is we'll say, well, let's apply the underline by default, and then when the user hovers over the link, let's remove the underline. And that makes it a little easier to tell that it's actually interactive. The other thing we might do with the nav bar is actually the reverse, where we might say, well, there's no link in the navigation, there's no underline in the navigation menu, but let's show the underline when they hover over it. So we can go both directions, but it's pretty common to enable and to turn on and off the underline when you hover over a link. That's standard practice. We can also set it as a bottom border. And some browsers, I think, do occasionally use bottom border as the way they set that underline. You can do that. In some cases, that may be what you need. But usually I'd say it's better to use the text decoration over trying to put a bottom border underneath. But you can swing it both ways. You can do it either way to apply the underline. All right, so let's look at an example of what this might look like to change the styling of links based on the user hovering over or focusing that element. So here I have a simple unordered list with 3 items. You'll notice that I have all of the links are inside of the LI, so notice LI and then the A's are nested inside of each other. Remember, they need to be in that order, not reversed. Here I've got my CSS, so I'm going to say by default I want them to have an underline and to be green. and then when the user hovers, focuses, or clicks on it, then I want to remove the underline, set text decoration to none, and then I want to increase the size of the font. So if I'm looking at the example here, we can see that when I hover over those links, that they get a little bit bigger and they lose that underline. And the nice thing there is it allows me to kind of see, what do I have selected? What am I hovering over? But more importantly, it tells me that I can actually click on it. It'll actually do something rather than it just being, styling. Because if I'm just looking at this and it didn't interact, it didn't change in any way, it might be unclear if this is just text that's underlined or if it's actually text that I can click on. So having that change, having that rollover, makes it more clear that there's actually interactivity there. One accessibility guideline for one thing to know is anytime you're applying hover, you should always apply the same styling for focus. Because remember, if I'm just using the keyboard, I'm never actually going to hover over anything. If I'm strictly using the keyboard and not the mouse, I'll have problems I may have problems with anything that you've set as hover but not focus. So a common thing that we do for accessibility is anytime we set a hover style, we'll also simultaneously apply the same styles for focus, which is what you can see here, right? We've applied the same styles for both hover and focus, and that way it works. Generally, that solves a problem of things not being the same or not user friendly, not accessible for keyboard access. So that's helpful. Okay. So generally we'll apply that on both sides. Okay, so also talking about links, we mentioned that there's the target attribute. I can use that target attribute to open the link in a different window. And specifically, if I set that target to _blank, it will open in another tab. There are some other underscore special values that you can use to change where the link opens. Nowadays, we don't really use any of those other underscored special keywords, but there are some out there. If you go do some digging, there's another one that lets you open it specifically in another window instead of another tab. But that is definitely frowned upon at this point. So just apply target equals _blank if you want the link to open another tab. So typically we'll do that with any links that point to an external website. So if it points to our own website, more than likely I'll want to have that link open in the same page and in the same tab. But if that link points to another website, then good practice is to open it in a separate tab. Similarly, if you have something like there's a link to a PowerPoint document or link to any sort of media files, typically you want that to open in another tab instead of opening the same one. Now, one thing that's worth noting from a historical perspective, if you set target to a value that doesn't start with an underscore, what you're ending up creating is a named tab or window. So if I say if I set the target to my thing, well, the next time I click on a link with the target of my thing, it will open up in that window called my thing. And that used to be something that we commonly use with pop-up windows. Websites have really strongly gone away from pop-up windows, because they were really, really badly exploited by nefarious users, nefarious web developers, and B, they were just kind of annoying. They weren't really very usable. Plus, they don't really work well on mobile. So we've moved pretty far away from using those, but you may still find some websites out there which are opening like a help pop up when you click on a link? Well, the way that they're often doing that is they're saying target equals a named value. So there's more that you can do with target, but really the important thing is that you set it to _blank is it opens up in another tab. Okay, so if we're looking at this example, normally without target blank, when I clicked on this link, it would open up in the same tab. When I click on it, you can see HTML test comes up in a separate tab. Okay. I can also use, I can also set up like a table of contents. There's another way I can use the anchor tags, and we'll walk through that because it's kind of an interesting use of links. So sometimes I may want to link within the same. Sometimes I might want to link within the same page. So let me pull up the placeholders example. 11 placeholders. Open. Why am I not seeing that? There we go. Open with live server. Okay. So here I've got my navigation or my kind of table of contents over on the left. And so I can specifically click on any of these links. So complete real world applications, that will take it down to this section, right? So clicking on that link scrolls me down to a particular part of the page. I can also click this link here, return to top, to go back to the page. Now, one thing that you might not see initially looking at here, because I don't have this full screen, full width, you can't really see what's happening with the address bar when I click those links. So let me run this full screen with live server again. I guess I didn't need to close that. But starting here, right, so I'm at 11 placeholders HTML initially when I go to this page. Watch what happens when I click on one of these links. So first of all, when I hover over it, you may or may not see that in the bottom left corner. But at the end of the URL, it says #reason7. Okay, so when I click on this, coordinated courses, it's going to take me down to this section. Well, what's changed in the address bar, you'll see how it's gone to #reason7. Okay, so that hash here actually is kind of becomes part of the URL. It says what part of the page are you looking at. I might go and change that manually, reason 5, and you'll notice that it changes where I'm at on the page. So those hashes can be used to change where on the page you're going to. Now, one thing you might ask is, what if I don't? One thing you might ask is where are these names coming from? And we'll get to that in a minute. But we also might want to look at, well, what happens if I just have a hash but no text? Well, hash mark by itself always points to the top of the page. Always points to the top of the page. So that's, if I want to go to the top of the page, I can say just go to hash. Here, the way it's actually pointing, if I click on this, yeah. So I click on those links, you'll see it's going to just the hash, which is how it's going back to the top of the page. So let's take a look at this HTML. Okay, so starting with the links that make up the nav bar, okay, we can see, well, each of these are A tags like we're used to, but notice that the href is kind of maybe a little bit different, not what we've usually done. So in the href, it says #reason1, #reason2, #reason5. Right, so the href isn't really your normal relative or absolute URL. It's just a link to a particular part of the same page. Okay, so each of these links go to that particular reason. Well, but how does it know what part of the page that is? Well, if I scroll down and go look at those different sections. So for instance here, look at this H2. Well, this H2 says reason 2. The ID of that H2 is reason 2, reason 3, reason 4, etc. So we've applied an ID to those H2 elements. So when we link to reason 1, 2, 3, etc., it's actually scrolling to the element with that ID. Scrolling to the element with that ID. And you can see all of our return to top links, well, they're just a single hash. So if I put in just a single hash as the href, that will always scroll it. That link will then scroll you to the top of the page. Okay. So a single hash will scroll you to the top of the page. If I put a hash and then some text, that will scroll you to that specific ID on the page. So that's how that's implemented. So you can use links not just to move from one page to another, or one document to another. You can also use them to navigate within a single page. So specifically, we kind of refer to those H2s, etc., that have an ID as the hashes. Okay, so we talked about that. Another thing that you can do, sometimes you may want to go from one page to another and link to a particular part of another page. So here I want to say, well, let's go to 8reasons.html, and we'll go directly to reason 6. So this link I could use from another page, not just the same page, but I could direct you to a particular part of that page. Okay. So let's talk about links to media files. So far we've done links around through HTML files, but we can actually point your links, your anchor tags can actually link to any sort of file. Okay, so specifically here we'll talk a little bit about PDFs, audio, video, but you can do the same thing with linking to, for instance, an image. Okay. So PDF stands for Portable Document Format or PostScript Document Format. I'm sure you've seen those before. It's a standard way of providing documents that are basically in a print format online, because nearly every operating system and browser is able to open a PDF at this point. So it provides a standard format. If you put things out on the internet as, say, Word documents or RTF files, rich text files, or OpenOffice files, or any other Word text editor, it's very unlikely that your reader will necessarily be able to open that, or that they will necessarily have all the fonts that you used in that document. So PDFs have the nice attribute that, first of all, they can be opened without any sort of special software. Most browsers just open them directly, as well as including the actual glyph data for fonts. So you don't have to worry about if I give somebody a PDF if they don't have that font installed, because the details, the important bits for that font are included in that PDF. PDFs are also reasonably compressed most of the time, so they also are nice and small compared to your average, say, Word document. Word documents are usually bigger than their associated PDFs, but that's not always true. MP3 is also a common sort of compressed audio file. There are a lot of different audio formats that you can use. MP3 being one of the more common, widely supported ones, but there are several others out there, which we'll get to in a later chapter. Similarly, MP4 is probably the most commonly supported video format that you'll see on the internet. So if I want to, say, put a link in my page to a PDF file, it's relatively simple. I might want to apply a few different attributes to that link. So first I'm going to specify the href. So I might say href, well, this points to documents instructor summary.pdf. I'm going to say that the type of that file is application/PDF. Now, that type gives the browser a hint as to how to open and view that file. And that type is what we refer to as a MIME type, M-I-M-E. So the MIME type tells it what kind of classification that file is. So there's a few different groupings, like text would be a text file, image would be an image file, there's an audio or video. So in this case, we're putting it into the application class. The application class is just the general, it's the other. It's anything that's not your normal text, audio, video that there's a lot of common applications for. Application is just other things. So application PDF is that MIME type. So that tells the browser that it should try to open this file in a PDF reader. Whether that be just another tab in the browser or that be another application entirely, that's up to the device and the operating system and the browser how to implement that, but it at least gives it a hint as what file to use, what kind of program to use. Because that's not always obvious with extensions. So as far as things go on the internet, typically when you're working with files in Windows, you kind of infer the type of file it is by the extension or the .pdf at the end. But that's not always true with things on the internet. The extension might not necessarily tell you exactly what kind of file it is. So target is used, the target here we use to say, well, I want to open this PDF in another tab. If I hadn't set a target, then the PDF would be opened in the same tab. But usually for usability purposes, it's definitely better to open up the PDF in another tab. So that's what we're doing here. I can do a similar thing with audio. So if I want to link to an audio file, I might put it as, here's an href. I'm going to say, well, it's type audio MPEG. So this is linking to an audio file. So you click, if you click that, it would open it and start playing it. Similarly, I might link to a PowerPoint slideshow. Here I'm specifying media chapter 1. PPS, so that's the name of my PowerPoint file. I'm not specifying a type, so I'm then kind of relying on the operating system to figure out what sort of application to use from that extension. So it'll try and figure out, okay, PPS, do I know what that goes to? Hopefully it will, and it will open it up in PowerPoint. Or download it and then open it up in PowerPoint. And also said open it up in another tab. Again, anytime you're opening something that's not an HTML file, you probably, if you're linking to something that's not an HTML file, it's probably worth going ahead and opening it up in another tab, just so the user can get back to where they were. We can also add links that can be used to get a hold of it, get in touch with us. So specifically, if we want a link that starts an email, in the user's default email client, I can start the link with mail to as the protocol. So I say mail to, this would be a mail to link. Well, it would open up, start a new email to support@murach.com. So for me, my default mail client is Outlook, so this would open up in Outlook. Similarly, I can add some additional info if I need to. So maybe I want to put some text in there when they click that link. Maybe I want them to go ahead and fill in some of those values. So here I added to that mail to link, and I've said CC is ben@murach.com, so they'll get added to the CC list automatically when you click that link, as well as setting the subject line to webmail. You can similarly, if I remember right, you can also pre-fill the body with some text. But you'll notice that those additional values, it starts with a question mark, and then we've got CC equals, subject equals, and then there's an ampersand between each of the different key value pairs. So that's how we can add additional values to mail to links. We can also have links for telephone numbers. So for, let's say you're using this on a smartphone, when you click this link, then it would automatically open your phone app with that phone number in there. We can also set the protocol to Skype. So here we've got Skype Murach support. This would be their username on Skype. That will then automatically try to start a Skype call or dial a Skype user if you have Skype installed. If you don't have Skype installed, then clicking this link does nothing, generally speaking. Similarly, if I try to click a telephone link on my laptop, it's probably not going to do anything with it because it doesn't know, it's not able to dial that phone number. So anytime you have any of these links, Tel or Skype, even Mail to, I would recommend putting the actual email address, telephone, Skype username in the actual text of the page, because otherwise the user may not be able to see that, because maybe they don't have a default email client. Maybe they're not using this on a smartphone. Maybe they don't have Skype installed. So if you just leave it, if you don't include that information in the actual text, it's just in the href, the user may not be able to get access to that information, depending on what device and such that they're using. All right, so we've covered a few different pieces as far as talking about how we build up lists. We talked about a few new things as far as links are concerned. Now we want to kind of pull that all together and talk about how do we build navigation menus. So in here we're going to be using a few different tags. We'll be using the nav, the new HTML5 nav tag, the semantic tag, and we'll be using UL, unordered lists, list item, and the anchor tags. So we'll be using all four of those. Okay. So one reminder as we're working through this, anytime you're creating a navigation menu of any sort, you should put that into a nav tag, into a semantic nav tag. That provides some hints to search engines, so it's good for search engine optimization, but it's also good for things where you may want to change where that navigation is based on like the size of the device, or another common use of that nav is maybe when the user tries to print a page on your website, you probably don't want to print the navigation menu. So if you put that into a nav, if you put all your different forms of navigation into nav semantic tags, it makes it very easy to turn off those nav tags when you go to print it. Okay. Now, one thing I need to discuss here, because oddly enough, the book kind of starts using it, but doesn't really explain what it is. I even checked the index of the textbook to see, well, where do they tell you what this display tag is? Where do they actually talk about it? So there is a little bit of discussion in there, but maybe not enough. So I want to talk about the CSS display property, and specifically what does it do. So earlier on, a few chapters ago, I mentioned that there's this idea of the CSS box model. Okay, well, the CSS box model applies to anything that is a block. So anything that's a block, we can apply background to, we can apply margin to, we can apply borders to, and we can apply margin, background, border, and all those kind of things. So that's anything that's a block. And typically, so a block breaks the line. Anytime you put a block in, breaks the line. So blocks will appear above or below. They won't just flow left to right. They will always appear on top of each other by default. Okay. Inline elements, in contrary, well, they keep running. They don't break the line. So you might think of like links, EM, strong, those all kind of go inline and they don't break the text. Okay. So we can actually, with CSS, we can actually change any element to be a different display type than what it is normally. So we can say display block, and now it will appear as a block element, even if it wasn't normally a block element. We can change something to inline by saying display inline. We can also do a weird kind of mishmash, which is inline block, which what that does is it makes it behave like a block element in the sense that we can apply borders and margin and padding and all those kind of things, which we normally can't apply to an inline element. We can now apply all those things with a block element, but it also makes it so that on the outside it still flows inside of other inline elements that are next to it. So that can be an interesting thing to use sometimes when you need things to flow next to each other, but you need some of the block attributes. We can also set display none. Now display none is an interesting one because what setting display none is, it actually hides the element as well as any child elements that are inside of it. Okay, so these are very helpful in terms of changing how things look. Okay, so the navigation menus that we're going to build here in a minute are going to rely heavily on those. Being able to change things to blocks, being able to sometimes, at least one of these examples, change things to inline elements, and as well as display none, which is how we hide things. So that's worth knowing. There are a bunch of other keywords that you can set display to. Some of them are newer and not supported by all browsers, and there's other ones that are applied by default. So for instance, if I'm looking at either an unordered list or an ordered list, all of the items in there, all the li tags have an actually their display type is list-item. By default, they are list-item. They're not block, they're not inline, they are list-item because they're special. Now, when we build our navigation menus here, we're going to use some unordered lists to build those. However, we don't want them to look like unordered lists. So in order to do that, one of the things that we need to remember to do is to change the display of our list items, whether we change them to block or we change them inline. That's all depends. Depends on if you want it to appear up and down, vertically or horizontally. So let's go into some of these examples here. By the way, if you want to find out more about the display property, here's a link. W3C has a few examples of that you can play around. And if you want to find the full documentation of it, MDN, Mozilla Developer Network, has a lot more details to it. Okay, so let's look at a few different kinds of navigation menus. So here's the first example. Here we have a vertical navigation menu. All of the links are arranged from top to bottom. So I have home, get tickets, become a member, about us. If I was going to have a vertical navigation menu like that, I typically might stick it as an aside on desktop, but vertical also works a lot better for mobile. So a lot of times on a mobile device we'll have a vertical navigation like this, but on a desktop we'll make it horizontal. So this can also be used not just as a sidebar navigation, but also as a mobile friendly sort of navigation. Okay, so here we have on the outside, you'll see we have our nav, and that nav we've given an ID of nav menu 1 because we're going to have a few different examples here. Inside of that I have a UL tag. I have items, so we have 4 different links, and you'll note that I've applied class current to the third link. So effectively, I'm saying that we are currently on the Become a Member page. So I'm trying to indicate that to the user somehow. So we're going to apply class current to the current page link. So that's going to make it look different. Okay. So let's look at the CSS to how we accomplish this look. So first here, I'm going to change the list style type to none. Okay, and the reason I'm doing that is because I want to remove the bullets that would normally appear on an unordered list. So that will disable the bullets. Okay. The next thing I want to do is to the LIs, I'm going to change them from their display from list item to block. So they're going to be block elements. All right. Well, that allows me to do all the other things I'm going to do from kind of here on out. So we're going to change that to a block. I'm going to set the width of that item to 200. So that's where they're always, all of these items are going to be 200 wide instead of occupying the entire width of the thing. I'm also applying some border to each of the items. And then next, I'm applying some tilings to the links that are inside of those items. And you'll notice here that I'm using descendant selectors. So I'm saying the UL that is inside of the menu 1, the LI that is inside the UL is inside nav menu 1, etc. So I'm using these descendant selectors to be more specific about which tags am I selecting. I'm not using type selectors here, which is strictly type selectors. I'm not saying apply this to all A's, apply this all to all LI's, all UL's. I'm saying only ones that are in this menu, and that's important. So I'm also changing the links. So remember, the links by default are inline elements. So I'm going to change them to blocks, and changing them to blocks is allow me to apply additional styling to them. So here I'm changing them to blocks. I'm changing the color of the text to blue, so we have blue links instead of where the browser default would be. And I'm turning off the underline, saying text decoration none, so that they're not underlined. And then finally, the last piece of CSS I have here is a.current. It's going to apply just the current element. We're going to change the background to silver, and that's where you can see this one looks slightly different. Okay, so that's a vertical navigation. If you look at the actual code in the book example, you'll see that there's quite a few more styles to it, but that's the basic gist of building a vertical navigation, at least a simple one. Okay. Now let's look at 2 examples for building a horizontal navigation menu. There's a lot of different ways that you can build a horizontal navigation menu. We're going to go through two here that are just a simple 1 tier. We'll then expand on this second example and build some 2-tier and some 3-tier 3-tier navigation. So here's one way to, both of these ways we use the same HTML. They look very different, but the HTML is actually really the same. So the first one, I've got a nav tag, and the only thing that changes between these two, this is nav menu 2, and this is nav menu 3. So nav menu 2, I've got 4 links. You can see I've applied current as we're currently on Become a Member. So we can see here it's applying without an underline. Here it's appearing with a yellow text. So I'm applying those in different ways. Okay. So let's look at this first example. So this first example, I'm changing the list style to none. So remember, that's going to remove the bullets from the unordered list. I am now I'm center aligning that unordered list. So that's where it appears kind of centered. I'm applying some border to the top and the bottom. So this is that top border, that top line, and that bottom line is the border bottom. The LIs, I'm changing them to inline elements. So remember on the previous example, I changed them to block elements so they would appear vertically. But here I'm changing them to inline so that they appear horizontally. The next thing I want to do is change some styling on the actual links. So the links, I'm going to say, well, by default, they should have, I want them to have some underline, and I want them to be blue. And then I'm going to make the current one, whichever page you're currently on, we're going to remove the underline from that. Okay. So that's one way I could set up a horizontal navigation. Another way I can set up horizontal navigation, here using block elements, remember that normally block elements would appear vertically. So in addition to making them blocks, I'm also going to use floating. So here I'm turning off the bullets because I don't want to have bullets appear for the unordered list. Just to explain why I'm using the UL in all three of these examples in these navigation menus is it does still have the semantic benefit of kind of adding it as a list. There's still some benefit to doing it that way, as well as it's going to make it easier to do some styling with it because we kind of need all these containers anyway to generally style a navbar. Okay, so we're gonna apply that styling. We're gonna set the list items. We're gonna set them to blocks, and we're gonna tell all of them to float to the left. So they're all floating to the left, so they're kind of gonna stack on top of each other from left to right. And here, so I'm also making the links themselves. Remember, the links are usually inline elements. I'm making them blocks, and I'm saying their width to 175. So each of these items will be 175 pixels wide. Now, recognize that this means that effectively I'm building a fixed layout. So this also means that there is a fixed width that's been set on the body to make this all work. Okay. So if you look at the full example, you will see that in the code, in the CSS. Text align center. So I want to say each item, each button, I want the item to be centered in the navbar. So here you can see each of the links are centered within the button, at least it appears. If I hadn't set text align center, then home would be over here on the left-hand side. Get tickets would be on the left, etc. So they would all be left aligned by default. I'm also saying text decoration none, which remember that takes off, gets rid of the underline. I'm setting the background color to blue. We've got white text so that the white text appears because white text contrasts well with the blue background. And then I have some border. Now note that I have a border right. It's only on the right side, 2 pixels solid white. So that's where you're seeing a little bit of separation between each of the links. Now, to correct for some weirdness that I might get because I'm only applying it to the right, I need to also remove the border from the last element. So there's a few different ways to do this. One way is to use a class and apply a class to the last item. But there's a pseudo selector that's in newer versions of CSS and supported by most browsers now called last of type. So here I'm saying go find, we're in nav menu 3, go find the UL, the unordered list, and let's say, well, let's pick the last list item. The last list item and its anchor. So the last item, we're going to apply a border right of none. Now it is important that I said last of type on the list item because the lists are siblings. The list items are siblings, but the anchor tags are not. Because remember, the anchor tags are nested inside of the anchor tags are actually nested inside of the list items. So if I said last of type A, this would actually not work. It only works if I put it on the list item because those are siblings. Okay. So that's how I'm removing the border from the last element. Okay. Here's our styling then for the current item. So the current item, we're setting it to yellow text. Right, so we've gone over 2 different ways to do this horizontal navigation bar. The next example I want to, one thing to keep in mind here, before I go on with that. One upside of doing it this way, the first example, is that it is quite a bit more fluid. This one centers all the links. It doesn't really rely on a fixed layout, whereas this one is more or less, it's a fixed because we're setting it to 175 pixels wide. Now, if I know that there's always going to be 4 items in the nav bar, I could set each of these to 25%. But oftentimes we're going to run into nav bars where, well, sometimes there's 5 items and sometimes there's 6, depending on what user you're logged into. So setting those to fluid values can actually be kind of hard with that in mind. So that's where oftentimes if we're setting it up this way, it's then going to be fixed sizes. Now, we want to build out a 2-tiered navigation, and you think, well, should I build it starting from this version or starting it from this version? Well, with inline elements, inline elements are not really allowed to have block elements as their children. So this example doesn't work if I want to add, this way of setting up a nav bar does not work if I want to add more tiers beneath it. So I do have to start with blocks if I want to be able to add more tiers or drop downs to those nav links. Okay, so here's what we're trying to build. Okay, so we're trying to set this up where either speakers or about us, we click on that, we go down and we get more links. So let me pull this up in the browser and we can kind of play around with it and see where this is going. So 1415 I think is this specific example. Oh no, this is 16 2-tier navigation. So we're going to open that up in the browser. Okay. So here, if I hover over speakers, you can see that it brings down this additional list of options. If I go to About Us, it also brings down the additional list of options. Now, another thing you want to make sure that you're doing when you're building these out, these multi-tiered navigations, do be forewarned that accessibility is definitely an issue. I've seen a lot of tiered navigation like this that doesn't work on mobile at all, so that's an issue. But there's also the case that you have to think about keyboard access. So if I go in here and I tab through, when I tab to speakers, it should pop out those options. If you use the code as is from the book, this doesn't happen. It actually, the code from that's written for the book does not support keyboard accessibility. It is what it is. So make sure that you're keeping that in mind. So here I fixed it so it does keyboard access. I'm going to go tab through, so you can see that we can get each of those options. So it starts going left to right, and then when it gets to the individual link inside, it starts going down. Okay. So let's start thinking about first, how would I write the HTML for this tiered navigation? So for the tiered navigation, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use nested lists for this. Because if I think about it, I sort of have on the outer tier, I have my list of the root navbar, and then each of this, well, this is another unordered list, and this is another unordered list. So I'm going to nest unordered lists inside of other ordered lists. So let's look at the HTML here. So at the root, I've got a nav element. Remember, for semantic purposes, I want to start with a nav, and I've given that an ID of nav_menu. Inside of that, I have my root unordered list. That's all the links here. And then each of those, I have an LI for each of these 4 items. So LI here is home, LI here is speaker, and then I've got become a member and about us. Okay. Now notice inside of these two, so both for the speaker item, I have another unordered list underneath it. So that's the options that are appearing when I hover over Those are the additional options. So under speakers, I have these 4 speaker items. Similarly, under about us, I have these 4 links. Okay. So a lot of these links are set to hash, which remember will navigate you to the top of the page. So that's kind of to have it there as a placeholder. If you don't set an href on, if you don't set any href on an anchor tag, then the link no longer becomes clickable. So in order for a link to become clickable, you do have to have an href. So that's where a lot of times these kind of root categories, speakers, about us, we would typically point that to the top of the page. Now, there is an interesting accessibility problem that we have here. Namely, okay, speakers is fine. Speakers points to the top of the page, but if I click on About Us, notice that that will take us to the About Us page. Okay, well, let me try to run this example here in mobile. Let's see where those two things might be different in a mobile space and might cause a problem. So here I'm on an iPhone 5. Well, if I click on speakers, okay, that's fine. It expands. In that process, it is scrolling to the top of the page. That's okay. Navbar is at the top of the page. If Navbar was not at the top of the page, that would be a problem because you would see that scrolling on mobile. Here, let's look at About Us, though. When I click on About Us, it immediately follows that link. So this 2-tiered navigation that we have here doesn't work because that About Us link actually goes somewhere. And that's probably the biggest mistake that the developers make when trying to build websites for mobile, is they make the mistake of having the root item point to something, right? But in order to make the drop-down appear, I have to actually be able to click on the item. So if I can't click on the item without it taking me there, well, that link doesn't work in mobile. So if I was going to fix this for mobile, what I would need to do is I would need to point that to the top of the page. So I can click on it here, and it just scrolls me to the top of the page. It doesn't take me to another page. And then I might need to move that About Us link down into the dropdown. So rather than having it up here at the root, I might put it down in here as an item. So that's a common kind of gotcha with working with mobile, is I need to have the link down here instead of allowing this link up here to be quote-unquote clickable to take me to that page. Okay, so that's an important thing to keep in consideration. You'll also notice in here that I've applied the current class to this item here, so Become a Member is the page that we're currently on. And that's that. So basically the way I'm implementing the 2-tier navigation in HTML is to use nested unordered lists. Now, you'll notice that that dropdown appears and disappears, right? So in order to make that happen, I need to be able to hide that second dropdown. And you'll remember what I said previously is that we can use the display property to hide and show items. So when you aren't hovered over it, by default, we'll make that second UL, we'll make it display none. That's how we're going to make it disappear. And then when you do activate it, whether you through keyboard focus or through hovering your mouse, that's where when it's hovered or focused, we're going to then expand it. We're going to change it to display block. Now, another thing that's one hint here. The way we hide and show it is through the display property. Another thing that's worth mentioning is, and thinking about is, well, how do I get it to appear like this, where it's kind of over, it's appearing over the text, right? So appearing on top of. But it's also not pushing this text away, right? It's not changing where that text is. So in chapter 6, I think it was, we talked a little bit about the positioning, CSS positioning, and setting it to absolute and relative. Well, this is where we're going to use that. So we're going to use relative positioning in order to position this drop down kind of beneath the item, and so it also floats above all the rest of the content on the page. So we're going to use relative positioning to make it appear down here. Okay. So let's look at the CSS and how we do that. Okay. If we look at the slide, you'll see that there are, I've kind of stripped down, there's a lot more CSS in the actual example to make this happen, but I want to focus on just the important bits. So first thing we want to do is on the UL, we're going to change its positioning to relative. So any ULs in the nav bar, we're going to change them to relative positioning to kind of create a root, because I want the submenus to be relative to the root menu. Okay. Then for the UL, for the submenus, you see I'm doing UL. So this is an unordered list that is inside of another unordered list. So this is the second tier, or it could be the third, or it's all tiers beneath it's any tier beneath the first. I'm initially turning it off. I'm hiding it. So I'm saying display none, so that will hide the submenus initially. I'm saying we want to position it absolutely, because I want it to appear beneath the other menu, and I'm going to say top is 100%. So that top is where should the top of the submenu be, and it's relative to the element that it's inside. So 100% in this case is the bottom of that menu item. So if I were looking at here, if I were to say the top is 0%, top 0% would be up here on the top side of this, and then 100% is down here at the bottom. So that's what's getting it to actually move down and be underneath. Okay, the next bits in here, we're saying float UL, ULLI, we're saying float them, don't float them. So remember this root level, we told all of those to float left, so appearing next to each other. Well, I then have to turn that off in the tier below to make them appear vertical. So to make that second tier appear vertical, I'm saying any LIs that are in that second tier, don't float them, they'll be then vertical. The next rule, and this is kind of the important one and the one to pay attention from accessibility for accessibility purposes, is I'm saying, okay, I want that submenu to appear when you either hover over it or it gains focus. So the first rule, there's a composite rule here. I'm using two rules together. So I'm saying nav menu, UI, LI. So anytime the first that LI gets focus, is hovered over, anytime that first tier is hovered over, I want to then look at if there's a direct descendant, which is the submenu, then change it to block. So change it from none, which we set it to previously, which was hiding it. Changing it to display block is then going to make it appear. And the part that we need to add to make keyboard work, when this is the part that's not in the textbook, is I need to add another rule that does focus within. Now, we've talked about the focus pseudo-class, but the focus pseudo-class, the way it functions, is it's only focus. There's only ever one thing on the page that has the keyboard focus. So focus only applies to that one element, not any of the parent elements or any child elements. So if I use focus within, what that says is if the focus is not just on that element specifically, but is in any of the children of that element, then apply this styling. So I'm saying if the focus is not just on the LI itself, but any child element of the LI, then we want to expand the UL. So this, in order to support keyboard access, that's what you need. You need that focus within. If you just use focus, it won't work because the LI doesn't actually get focus, nor does it maintain focus when you go into the menu. So if you use focus within, it gets focus when I initially go to it, which is here. But at this point, notice the thing that actually has focus is the anchor tag. It's not actually the LI that has focus. It is the anchor tag that has focus. And when I go down here, it's these anchor tags that are then in that descendant, that UL, that submenu of links. So the thing that actually has focus, this whole process, is an anchor tag. But if I go down to that anchor tag and use focus, then I can't go back up the tree and say, well, now I want to change that UL. So that is a very important pseudo selector in order to make these multi-tiered windows work with keyboard, is using focus within. Do note focus within is supported on pretty much all modern browsers, but it is not supported by some of the older versions of like Internet Explorer. So do be forewarned that they will you still may need to do some special things if you're trying to support older versions of Internet Explorer. The last piece here to draw your attention to is this little clear fix section. So this clear fix is sort of you might call it a hack to make floating work, because otherwise, when I'm building up these navigations menus, you're going to have some weird behavior where things appear on top of each other. So for instance, in this two-tiered navigation case, if I remember right, if I go back and look at this here, let's say I turn off this little clear fix section and see what the problem is. You can see it's appearing close to it, but in some cases it can appear in such a way that it appears underneath it, or other weird oddities can happen. So what this clear fix does is it kind of magically inserts an element at the end that has clear both set on it. So here I'm saying nav menu, the direct descendant, which is kind of at the root. So at the root, I'm going to say UL, and then after. So after is, remember, double colon means pseudo element, or kind of, you can think of that as a virtual element. So this kind of this selector, this rule that I have, is going to create kind of an imaginary element after the UL. It's still going to be inside of the nav menu, but it'll be after the UL. Okay, and that fake element, well, I can apply this special content attribute to. So content, this only works with two special pseudo elements. It works with after and it works with before. So after allows you to put things, kind of insert an element after one element, or before would let you put an insert an element before. Originally this was intended as a way to kind of add quotes with CSS around block quotes and things like that, but it's been used for a lot of other things now. So here we're adding content, we're just setting an empty string. So I don't really want it to appear. I don't want this element to actually show up, but I just kind of want to add it there so I can apply some CSS to it. So I'm going to add an element after the UL, and I'm going to change that to display as a block, and we're going to apply clear both. So that's going to keep anything from kind of falling out, from breaking, because we are doing floating with the blocks. Because we're floating the So that clear fix is going to fix any issues that might occur because we're doing that floating on the individual items here at the root level. Okay, if we weren't doing floating, if we were using a different tool, then we wouldn't, to get those to be horizontal, then we wouldn't need to do that clear fix. All right, so let's look at a little bit more of the CSS. The last part to kind of pay attention to is some styling that we're applying to the actual links themselves. So the links, what I have here, we're saying let's make each of the links a block. Let's make their width to 175, so that's going to make it kind of this fixed width that I have here. Center them, pad them, turn off their underline, because by default the browser would add an underline. We're going to set the background color to blue, the foreground color to white. That's the text color that you're seeing here. We're also making the text bold. Next in here, we're also going to highlight the current link, the current page that you're on. So we're currently on Become a Member. So we're going to turn that yellow. And then the last bit of styling here is how I'm kind of showing you what is the currently active link. So whenever you hover or focus one of those links, we're doing two things. We're changing the background to gray, and we're also changing the foreground to white. So that's giving us some indication of what link are you currently selecting. All right, so that's everything for the two-tier navigation, right? So if I want to just throw one extra submenu down there, I can do that. But what if maybe I need a third tier? What if maybe I need to have another level beneath that upper level? Okay. Well, in that case, we would go into something in that case we would say, we'll add another tier, we'll call it three-tier navigation. So what I'm trying to get to is I'm going to add another level. All right, I'm going to open up this example 1718, open with live server. So here, when I go into speakers, specifically if I go down to Scott Sampson, you'll see that there's a third tier of options, right? So we go from here, then down and over, there's a third tier. Similarly, if I go to About Us and past speakers, you'll see that I can get to the year, right? So if I have a lot of links I need to put in my navigation menu, I might end up needing to break them down further into more tiers. Now, if I start with just the CSS, if I use just the CSS that we had for the two-tier navigation, that will not work for the third. So there's some additional some additional styling that I need to add to support this additional tier of navigation. Okay, most of it will say pretty close to what it was for the two-tier navigation, but there's some additional things I need to add. So specifically, as far as changing the HTML is first concerned, under Sampson, you can see I'm keeping that anchor tag, but I'm adding another level. So I'm adding another UL inside of here, another unordered list. So that's going to be those different levels. So it's going to be September and February. Also under here, under past speakers, that's where I'm adding another ordered list for those years. So let's look at what the CSS is that I need to add so to support that third tier. So to support that third tier, I need to make the LIs, I need to first make them relative because they're going to be used as the root for that third tier. Okay, so I want all of my LIs, any LI that I have at any tier, that needs to be relative so that anything that's beneath that is relative to what's above that. Okay, now for the third tier, and you can see I'm saying nav menu UL, UL, UL. So a UL that's inside of a UL that's inside of another UL. I'm using a kind of triple triple level there. So if it's 3 tiers or below or further below, we're going to change the positioning of that to absolute. And then we're going to move it to the left. So we're going to say left 100%. So if I said left 0%, that would be the leftmost side of the upper of the preceding level. So for instance, if I'm looking here at the third tier, if I said position it left 0%, that would put the third level menu here on this left-hand side, but I want it to be on the right. So I'm saying 100%, well, it's 100% of this item's width. So that's what's putting it over here. I'm also saying top 0, which is aligning it with the top of the preceding menu level. Okay. Now, for the last menu, you'll notice that when I go to Scott Sampson, it expands to the right, which is fine here. I've got plenty of space. When I go to the right one here, I need to actually expand it to the left because otherwise it would be off the screen. Okay. If I were to turn that bit of CSS off that's doing that, here, let me remove that rule for a second. If I didn't have that rule, that would be appearing here, potentially off the screen. So it may be that, it's often the case for the last link in the navigation that we may need to change the direction that it comes out. So this one's coming out to the left. So on the last one, I'm saying, okay, take the last LI, take the last list item, and this is specifically the last list item at the top tier. So the last list item here, and then go down, this is the second UL, and then go down the third UL. So that third level will position to the left. 100% will be positioned over here. So that's what's happening with that. It's positioning it, most of them to the right, most of the submenus to the right, except for the last one, which will be positioned to the left so it doesn't fall off the screen. All right. So that's everything that we need to cover from chapter 7. And that'll get you started on building 1-tier, 2-tier, and 3-tier navigation menus. Do be forewarned that these tiered navigation menus, as we set them up here, they don't fully work in a mobile sort of use case. They don't necessarily work that well on touchscreens. They can be at least reasonably useful if you play your cards right, but you saw at least there's that one case. If I click About Us, it takes me to the page rather than allowing me to expand and see the options. So in the upcoming chapters, I think both Chapter 8 we'll talk about something called SlickNav, which kind of is a third-party tool that will build this for us and provides some functionality to make it mobile-friendly, kind of an alternate way of displaying it, where it uses a vertical navigation bar on mobile devices and a horizontal bar on horizontal navigation for larger devices. We'll also, in a few weeks, we'll talk about, I think probably next week or two, we'll talk about Bootstrap. And Bootstrap provides some better navigation, a better way to do this navigation that is fully mobile responsive. So that's what we'll do in the future. We'll be using the Bootstrap navigation bar for this. But we want you to get started kind of understanding what are some of the gotchas with kind of building this yourself and styling it, because it may be that you even using the Bootstrap one that you may need to make some tweaks to it. But you want to understand what all the things are that kind of go into that. Okay, so as far as objectives go for this lesson, just to refresh and summarize what we talked about here. We talked about how to build 1-tier, 2-tier, and 3-tier navigation menus. And we talked about 3 different kinds of HTML lists, namely the UL, the unordered list, the ordered list, and the definition list. We talked about anchor tags. We talked about how to build anchor tags that link to another page, that link to media. We talked about anchor tags that link within the same page, using that hash mark and pointing to the ID of an element. We talked about how to use target to open links in another tab. We talked about how to use title for tooltips. We also talked about linking to some meeting files and using that type attribute to specify what kind of media file that is linking to. We talked about briefly talked about how to make links to send emails, the mail to links. We talked about telephone links, phone number links. And we also talked briefly about Skype links. We talked about how to use link, visited, and hover and focus to change how the links look based on if the users, like for instance, hovered over it, if they visited that link before, or if their keyboard focus is on that link. Remember, for accessibility, if you apply styling to hover, you should also apply it to focus. And then we briefly talked about how to use text decoration to show and hide the underline. All right, so that's the end of chapter 7. Your reading assignments are up on Perusal, as well as your individual lab assignments are up on Inside Reiko. All right, so that's the end of this, and I'll let you get back to work. All right, thank you for your time.